You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. This is a special episode because we are cross-posting an episode of Cogs of War, our podcast on defense technology and industrial issues, brought to you by us at War on the Rocks and our partners at Booz. It's a special episode because it features my wide-ranging conversation with Horacio Rozanski, the CEO of Booz. In this conversation, we trace his remarkable journey from immigrant to intern to CEO of one of the most influential firms in defense and technology. We talk about how he is reshaping Booz into a true technology integrator, and how he thinks about the future of talent, strategy, defense technology and innovation, and artificial intelligence. It was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I haven't met many CEOs with your background. I think you're the first CEO I met that, personally at least, that grew up in a dictatorship. What was it like growing up in Argentina during a military dictatorship?
The thing that's interesting is, especially when you're a kid, you know what you know. And so it was normal to live in a situation where you didn't have a lot of freedom, where you didn't have the ability to say what you wanted, where your parents had to be concerned about what they told you because you could go repeat it in school and get them in trouble. So I had what I describe as a pretty good upbringing, middle-class family. We didn't have everything we wanted, but we had what we needed. In hindsight, it could have been terrifying. You know, we learned to march and parade rest and everything else at 5 years old. We had very short haircuts mandated. I mean, if your hair was within 3 fingers of your shirt collar, you got sent home. You look at it now, I look at it through the eyes of my kids, and I say, wow, that was different. When a teacher came into the room, you stood up at attention until they told you to sit down. You know, it was very militaristic. They ran a campaign, silence is golden, and obviously there was a double meaning there. And that's how it went. And then the challenge, of course, it was when we finally had elections and everything else, things shifted. The pendulum swung too far over, all the way over. And we went from everything was so rules-based and you couldn't say anything to a world where there were no rules and you couldn't do anything. And so it was an interesting time to grow up. It made me appreciate this country so much more when I came here, by the way.
And you played water polo too. Do you think that shaped the way you view anything in an important way, at least the athletic experience?
You know, the teamwork part of it. You operated as a team, you trained as a team, you won and lost as a team. That has been a big part of how I think about the world. You know, I was actually, when I was a little kid, I've always loved the water. Anything water related, I always wanted to do. And I was actually a very good swimmer. But swimming is more, you're alone with your thoughts for long periods of time and you swim your own speed and everything else. And what I loved about water polo is it incorporated the things that I was good at, but in a team and also in a country where 100% of the population plays soccer, which I do, you know, by Argentinian standards, I'm not very good. By US standards, I'm actually pretty decent. It was different. And it's a good sport because it keeps you out of trouble. It requires a ton of training.
A lot of endurance.
A lot of training, a lot of endurance. I mean, we would train 4 or 5 hours a day.
And one of the things that I believe attracted you to the U.S. was the education system and the meritocratic system that we have here in the U.S. How did you first become attracted to the idea of coming to the U.S. and how did you make it happen?
So interestingly, my dad, who's one of my heroes, grew up very poor. Like his dad died when he was 8, his mom died when he was 20. My dad is one of those people that grew up not knowing if or when or where the next meal was going to come from. And he pulled himself up by the bootstraps, ended up going to college, ended up going to law school, and got a scholarship from the Ford Foundation in the 60s to come and study here for a year and a half. And my whole life, I kept hearing these stories about a system that was totally different than the one I knew. And so, again, when I did a year of college in Argentina, and it just wasn't for me. It was, you know, the professors would arrive 2 hours late and nothing really mattered. The passing grade was a 4 out of 10.
This would have been in what, the mid-'80s or something, or late 80s?
So late 80s, I think, they call it 86, 87. And so my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, said, let's do something else. And there was only one place we wanted to come to, which was here, and got a great opportunity to come study here. Ended up at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, of all places. You know, when you're young and you make a decision that should make no sense and ends up being the best thing you ever did, this is squarely in that category. To come into this country through the lens of the Upper Midwest, through that value system, I was hooked.
Tougher winters.
Tougher winters. I came in January of 88. So in January of 88 in Argentina, it was probably 100 degrees, 120 degrees in the shade. And I get here and land in Minneapolis and it's minus 40, right? So I discovered that what I thought were winter clothes were not winter clothes, but I loved it, loved every minute of it.
And your host family ended up playing a pretty important role in your life. You got married in their backyard.
We got married in their backyard. Great people who had no reason to take us in the way they did, but they did. And we loved them. And they were just incredible people. And again, people that showed us sort of the character of this country in a way that we wouldn't have seen if I had better guidance and had gone to school in New York or, one of the big cities.
You also experienced one of the, I guess you can call it great, sometimes horrifically boring American experiences, which is long road trips or bus rides across the country at around this time, right?
Wow, you're into deep research now. We came in with a partial scholarship, didn't have a lot of money. In pesos, being here was extraordinarily expensive. And you don't get loans or anything like that as an international student. And so we were out of high and with a minimum wage job in college. And so the way to get to visit my wife's aunt in Brownsville, Texas, so at the very, very end of the country, is to take Greyhound, 44 hours. So we would do that for spring break. But again, you get to see a lot of the country in a way that I've not seen since when you're in Oklahoma City waiting for the next bus at 2 a.m. The thing about it is when you're 19 or 20 or 21, first of all, you can sleep anywhere in any position. Now I wake up from a normal night's sleep and something hurts. At that point, you just turn yourself into a pretzel. They could have stuffed me in a bag and sent me. But it was fascinating. Again, it was part of the adventure of being in a new country, of learning, of getting acclimated and getting to see the country in a way that, again, if we had done it differently, we would have never been privy to. And each one of these things was another brick of the wall for how I fell in love with this country.
And right after you graduated college, you were hired as an intern by Booz Allen.
So I went from college straight to grad school. And in between the 2 years of grad school, I joined Booz Allen as a summer intern.
How did that opportunity surface itself? And how did you even hear about Booz Allen at the time? Because I imagine you're an Argentinian immigrant. How did this company even come across your radar?
They were on campus interviewing, and I interviewed with them as I did with lots of other companies. Frankly, I think the only reason they hired me is that they were looking for interns that were willing to go back to Argentina and spoke the language and everything else. And that gave me a bit of a leg up. I applied to a ton of jobs. I got very few offers. And the rest is history. I thought I was going to join Booz Allen for 2 years. It was a good name to have in your resume. This was in our old commercial business, private sector business, not the business we're now. And again, I enjoyed it. I was able to join full-time in our Cleveland office. And 2 years came and went, and then 2 more years came and went. And every time that I thought it's time to start looking, they would give me an opportunity that frankly was almost overwhelming. And I always like mountains that you don't know how to climb. And so every time I was reaching the top of whatever I was doing, I'd be given something else that I didn't know how to do. And that kept me here. And at some point, my wife said to me, you're going to retire from Booz Allen someday.
How far along in the journey was that she said that? Do you remember?
Maybe 20 years ago.
And was there, do you think, one boss early on that made a difference, that especially inspired you, that showed you the ropes?
I had a number of them. The thing that I have always thought about is I'm a lifelong learner. And so I was always looking for who can teach me what. And nobody is great at everything. And I'm not great at so many things. There's always somebody that I'd say, so this person knows how to explain and express things in a way that I don't know. I'm going to go learn that from them. This boss is particularly good at this thing. I'm going to learn that from them. And that portfolio has been great. To this day, I learn a lot from people around me, people that work with me, people that are on my team, people that are not at Booz Allen. And I pick out, what does this person know how to do that I would love to get better at? And the thing that's most interesting is if you ask somebody to teach you, I've never had somebody say, no, not interested. Just people don't ask.
This is something that comes up a lot in conversations I have with successful people, and especially in successful insurgents, is when you come back and say, what made the difference early in their career? And they always say they had people that they can go to that helped them learn how to do things. And they could go to and say, help me figure this out. And people that were willing to do that.
Exactly right. You just have to be willing to be open to it. And then the hardest part is you actually have to take their advice. Not all the time. I've gotten some bad advice over the years, some of which I followed, some of which I rejected. But for the most part, you have to be willing and open and really listening hard for their advice and leave behind a lot of your preconceptions. I had one time at 3 a.m, I don't know why we were in the lobby of a hotel at 3 a.m, somebody was mentoring me and gave me completely counterintuitive advice. And I said, well, I'll try it. And it's probably some of the best advice I've ever gotten.
Once you moved beyond intern, you joined full-time after you got your MBA, right?
Yeah.
What side of the house were you on? What problems were you working on at first?
So I was actually trained by a guy named Chuck Lucier on corporate strategy. And there weren't that many people at Booz Allen doing it, which made it pretty special. And he was really a great mentor. He was probably one of the smartest people I ever met. He consumed extraordinary amounts of Diet Coke. A 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke and a bag of Twizzlers was his go-to breakfast. And it escalated from there. I tried not to learn that from Chuck. But I will tell you what I did learn from him is he knew how to break down a problem and take that problem apart, work on the pieces and put it back together like nobody else I've ever met since. Over time, I think, if I may say so myself, I think I was a pretty good consultant. But the thing I was not learning was leadership. And so I was attracted to that side of the house. How do you lead? What's it take to lead? How do you learn to project your values, your voice, your vision, your ideas when it's 100 people or 500 people or people around the world that you don't get to meet regularly?
Or 33,000 people.
As we are now, yeah. But you got to start, you got to build to that if you're lucky enough. And I've been super lucky. And the two most seminal people in that, the guy that was running our private sector business, Dan Lewis, gave me a chance, which he shouldn't have given me, to go be part of his leadership team at a very, very early point in my career. Then Ralph Schrader, who was my boss for a long time and my predecessor in this job, is probably the person that I've learned more from than anybody else.
You became vice president in 1999, and then, about 10-something years later, you became chief personnel officer and chief strategy and talent officer. I think it's really interesting to talk to, there's not many of you that then go on to become CEOs that lead on the personnel and talent side of the house. Listeners to this show and also to the main War on the Rocks podcast have heard me say this before, but I believe all problems and opportunities are fundamentally human in nature, not technological. And the technological aspects of it are really just meant to enable the human side of it. How do you think that affects the way you approach leadership through the lens of this personnel side?
Well, let me start by saying I'm a geek. If I'd been born 20 years later, I would have been a data scientist. So I come from the side of the house that loves math. And
no one's perfect.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Math is great. My kids love the story of how I got into math, but that's
well, let's hear it.
That's for a longer podcast and a different day.
We got time. Let's hear it.
So when I was in the second grade, they were putting together the school choir. They did auditions, and my whole grade got into the choir except for me. My homeroom teacher, the equivalent of my homeroom teacher, now had to stay in class and not have a break because I didn't have anywhere to go during choir practice. And so I think as a way to maybe punish me, she would give me math problems. And I discovered I was pretty good at it. And that began my long love with math. And even though I did study business, I probably had enough credits to get a major in statistics. I did PhD level statistics classes when I was at Chicago. And at Booz Allen, I was doing a ton of highly analytical data with what was big data back then, which is a joke now. And so I came up from that side, and I was a very analytical guy, but I always cared about people. And I like people who cared about me. And so Dan Lewis gives me this opportunity to go become the head of talent and personnel on a global basis at a time when I was trying to learn to lead. What a great opportunity. I said to Dan, the only qualification I have for this job is my initials, HR, right? But he was all in and gave me the chance. And again, this is a time where all my mentors said, don't do it, because this is, quote unquote, the overhead side of the house, and you're a good leader on the revenue side of the house. But I wanted to try things because I didn't know how to do it. And I think that's what propelled the rest of my career. I mean, as I look at it, I tend to agree with you. A lot of everything, and even when you talk to venture capitalists that are investing in the most advanced, most leading edge technologies and ideas, we all say the same thing, which is at the end of the day, you invest in people and learning to understand people, what makes them tick, how they think about it, some of the dumb things that all of us humans do and what motivates us to do those kinds of things. has been great for me. And I think it's allowed me to bring that sensibility to my job. And I think people will tell you I can still do math.
At least one of us can. As my team knows, whenever I have to do math on the fly, it's always a pretty dire situation. You became CEO in 2015. And when did you start working on Vision 2020?
Ralph gave me the opportunity to start working on that in 2012. I had just become Chief Operating Officer. And I went to him and I said, we had a very successful transformation process as Booz Allen that he had led. That was called Vision 2000. It was in the 90s. And V2K. And I wanted to honor that, but I also loved the double entendre of 2020 vision. And, I wanted us to look further out than just a couple of years. And the timing was fascinating, right? Because this is right before sequestration and we'll have to, I'm sure, explain that to people who don't live in this world.
I unfortunately do remember what that is, but yes.
So a little after that, there was something called the Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act was written in a way that it was going to force Congress to pass a better budget with lower deficits than what they had had before, or else. And the or else was that there was going to be automatic cuts across the board. It was almost like putting a gun to your head and saying, well, if I don't do this, the gun will go off.
And it turns out the gun went off.
And it turns out that the gun went off. And that created a whole amount of disruption for the government and for all of us who operate in the defense industrial base. But right before that, we had begun this process called Vision 2020 that said, what is Booz Allen going to be? What is Booz Allen going to do next? What's our next wave of transformation? Now, I had come from the private sector side of the house, so I had lived through how technology had fundamentally transformed the private sector. I did a lot of work with my clients back in the day around how do you become digital? How do you take what you do and make it web-enabled? How will new entrants going to fundamentally transform what you do? But none of that had really happened at scale in the government in 2012. But it was coming. And so we made two decisions that were fundamental. One was we needed to get closer to the center of the missions that we supported. That had begun in some places like in cyber, where Booz Allen was already by 2012 the leading cyber provider to the intelligence community, which meant both defense and offense. And it had accelerated during post 9/11, where we did a lot of the work around counter ID and accelerating that process. We did a lot of the work around creating the counterterrorism fusion centers. And so we were much closer to the mission, but we knew there was a need to both get closer to the mission and then in the mission to bring new technologies to transform it. And that was the sort of the fundamental idea of Vision 2020 is we can become a company that brings advanced technology into the missions in a different way. And that was the beginning of a fundamental transformation. And it's really sort of the seeds of who we have become.
And then becoming president in 2013, CEO a couple of years later, chairman last year. Congratulations on all the promotions. You've had the opportunity to execute on this, which I think it's fair to describe it as fairly or unfairly. When you talk to some people, especially people my age, I'm over 40 now, and a lot of people think about Booz Allen as it used to be more known for consulting, transforming into something that's primarily focused on technology and technology integration. What are some of the challenges in making that happen?
As with everything in organizations, the fundamental challenges are not do you have the right ideas, or sometimes they're not even do you have the right people. They're cultural. How do you transform who you are and what you do and the sources of value that you create in a different way? The getting closer to the mission had a lot of impact on who we became as a company. We used to do, as I said, a lot of work for the private sector around the world. We had to limit that quite significantly the closer we got to national security missions. Case in point, a couple of years after I became CEO, I was personally sanctioned by Iran.
Congratulations.
It is a bit of a point of pride. But the point is, you could protect me as an organization, but you could not protect all of our people around the world in the same way you could protect the CEO. So we had to rethink what we did and how we did it. There's places in the world where I cannot go. There's places in the world where Booz Allen people cannot go. And that limited, in some ways, our scope of business, but it also opened up a whole set of opportunities. And we had to be willing to embrace them. We had a lot of discussion and debate about what does it mean to become a technology company. When we first started this journey, about a third of our workforce was technologists. Now, over 2/3 of our workforce is technologists. We have about 10,000 veterans at Booz Allen, which is an extraordinary point of pride for me.
It's a third of the workforce.
Yeah, and it's absolutely love it. I never served, being able to work alongside people who care about this country as much as they do, who know about leadership more than I will ever learn. It has been probably in the honor of a lifetime. But all of that meant creating a different culture, creating a different business system, and committing to things in a completely different way. Big parts of our business went away in favor of new parts of the business that we were building. And that becomes personal for people, of course. And so navigating all of that was probably the hardest part. But now that we are here, it is so incredibly rewarding to see us have the types of impacts we have on missions today, the things that we're building inside of those missions today, the value we create for our national security as a country, again, as an immigrant that loves this country. I'm so privileged to be able to have a front row seat to it.
Take me under the hood a little bit. How does the implementation of this strategy work?
So for the most part, I think what we needed to do was get very clear about where we wanted to grow. I think a lot of people worry a lot about the boundaries and what they're not going to do and all of that. And I think that makes sense at some level. But I've always believed from a strategy standpoint that if you define the core of what you want to be very clearly, the boundaries evolve by themselves over time. So we never had to say, well, we don't want to be in this business anymore. The reality is if we were going more towards technology, a lot of things we were doing that might have been more staff augmentation and things like that are treated over time by themselves. And by the way, not setting a very hard boundary was a really good idea because it turns out that having people that are in the mission, performing elements of the mission, greatly enable us to deliver technology that works. As you know, a lot of the challenge with tech today is it gets built without enough understanding, enough insight of how a warfighter, an intel analyst, a claims processor at the VA is going to use it. They have a theory of the case for it, but it's a lot different than having the people who had to carry that backpack.
Yeah, they don't get next to the user and figure out how their problems actually exist.
Right. And our teaming culture is such that we are one of the few places where the people that are building the ruggedized compute device and are working alongside the people, sometimes are the same people, but are at a minimum working alongside with the people that have had to wear these things in the field and are saying, you cannot put a fourth battery pack on me, that's not going to fly. So you got to build this thing in a way that it can operate off of a single battery pack, which are things that, the rest of us don't necessarily think about. So I'm proud of the fact that all the stuff that we build, and we can talk about some of it, it works when it's wet, it works when it's hot, it works when it's freezing, it works if you fall and you get up, it's still working. I think that that's the kind of stuff that comes, again, from the insight of the folks who have had to live in those conditions and are not going to let you get away with, well, it meets the requirements. Yeah, that's okay, but are the requirements right?
So where does Booz Allen go from here then? What is the sort of next phase, the next step?
So right now, I feel Booz Allen is an advanced technology company delivering into these missions at speed and at scale. And again, there's a lot of great companies out there. I think we are one of the few, if not the only one, that can really say that and mean it if you look at our portfolio. We're a company of builders. We are building software, we're building products, we're building technologies that are powering our national security for the next generation. Now, where do we go from here is we need to take that to the next level. And what that means for me is how do we do it faster? Part of the faster is going to be we need to leverage our partnerships in a different way. We need to double down on our investments on these advanced technologies, especially the ones that haven't hit yet. And we need to continue the effort at transforming our workforce so that it can compete and win and succeed faster than we have before. And so if I look at a Booz Allen 5 years from now, I think I'm looking at a Booz Allen that has traveled this whole journey to the place where some of the things that we are building are larger and more recognized than the things we have done in the past and have pushed both the frontier and the thinking of both what we think we can do, but really of what our customers, especially national security, think can be done. And we're talking about things in space, some of which we can talk about and some of which we cannot. We are talking about the integration, for example, of cyber and AI into both products and technologies that are going to be essential to the fight. And we are talking about leveraging the next generation, for example, of physical AI and of quantum into the fight. And I want Booz Allen not just to be doing it, because to some degree we are doing that now, but to be doing it in a much larger way and fundamentally to be more recognized for doing that. not because we want the publicity, but because this is what will attract the next generation of talent that is going to keep this flywheel going into the future.
Given how closely Booz Allen obviously works with the Defense Department, what do you think your company and companies like yours have to learn from the military about strategy and vice versa?
I think one of the things that we have learned the most from the military side to think about scenarios. Military leaders are constantly thinking about potential scenarios, courses of action, and fundamentally revising that on an ongoing basis. You know, the old adage that plans never survive contact with the enemy is so true, and is so true in a business context. You know, I guess Mike Tyson has a similar version of it, right? I mean, everybody has a strategy until they get punched in the face. And military leaders understand how to evolve their plan without losing sight of the objective. And that is something that we have, I believe, gotten better and better at over time. I think by the same token, I think what we bring into these conversations is a broader sense of what's out there, both in terms of opportunities and courses of action.
In a past episode of Cogs of War with our friend at Lockheed who used to run Skunkworks, we talked about some of the advantages that these older companies have when it comes to AI. A lot of these AI companies are incredible, and which is not to take away from what they've accomplished because it's truly remarkable and we use these tools every day. But my personal view is as these foundational models become commoditized, the future really belongs to companies that have unique proprietary expert data, something that a company like yours, which is over 100 years old, has in spades. But of course, the devil's in the details. It all comes down to implementation. How do you think about how your company needs to best use this data in order to get the most value out of it for your company and for the warfighter?
First of all, we started with AI in 2017. I used to talk to our investors about it, and they used to roll their eyes. And then all of a sudden, we became smart when AI exploded in the way it did in public consciousness. But what we saw in AI was an extraordinarily powerful set of tools that were only going to get better around how do you process information at speed. And speed is the name of the game in national security for sure. Having said that, the challenge with a lot of these AI foundational models or companies that are building these broad-based things is their economics require you make it one and you sell it in the way it is to as many people as possible. And I think that's what a hyperscaler is all about, right? Or a company that wants to become a hyperscaler. The real power in terms of creating value is going to be in the use case. How do I take this fundamentally powerful technology and make it truly transform the mission? And that's the place that we believe we occupy in that value chain. And to your point, that's a combination of a number of things. We have people, first of all, that come from these technology companies that help build some of these foundation models. We have people that have been working in these areas or are working at the next generation. And we could talk about what's next for AI from our perspective. But we also, again, 10,000 veterans and the like, we have people who understand, once they see the tool, the problems it can really solve and how to solve it. And bridging that part is where there's tremendous power and tremendous untapped potential, because you can't give ChatGPT to a unit deployed downrange in dangerous conditions and say, good luck, go to town with it. Because they're probably going to lose connectivity within the first 5 minutes, because even something as simple as their display cannot light up in the dark because that's going to give away their position. There's so many things that have to go into turning these technologies useful at the point of use, whether it's in national security, whether it's in defense, even in many of the civilian use cases. There's still a lot more to do there, and there's real power there. And I agree with you. I think this fundamental underlying technologies, much like it happened with the cloud, will continue to evolve, will continue to get strong, but it's how do you use it where the real power will come in.
And your company's been working with other companies on this. I know you've been working with Palantir and other companies. And a lot of this, I think it's interesting, is the sort of model level versus the application level and the data. There's also other companies at the application level like Legion Intel, and OneBrief has a really ambitious AI roadmap that I think is very exciting, and others. We could name a bunch of others. How do you think about what your company needs to develop organically versus partnerships with other companies?
So we come into this from a perspective of speed, right? I mean, we want to get to the warfighter what they need as soon as possible. One caveat is it has to work, and it has to work the first time. I really believe in failure as not just an option, but as a necessity upstream of the process. We need to be trying a lot more things in these missions before we settle on which ones are going to work and all of that. But once you're actually going to give it to a warfighter at scale, that has to work. But to do it quickly, you can't reinvent the wheel. So the view that we take is we are constantly scanning. We need to have a complete understanding of what's out there. The things that are most powerful, we need to be invested in, both either as a partnership or actually as an investor. We have a venture fund. And then we look for opportunities to then close the technology gaps that exist to make that really useful in the mission. I'll give you an example. Most of the cloud architectures that exist today assume that the majority of the users, if not all of the users, are going to be sitting on really good power lines, on really good fiber, and that there isn't somebody else trying to deny them access. Most of the people that we work with have none of that. And in fact, part of the adversary's tactic is if they can deny access, they can blind you. So we have built a lot of technology on top of existing technology so that things can update back when they're in sync much faster than they were originally created. There's one great edge application by a large technology company, leading edge, super powerful, but if it loses sync, it can take 45 minutes to resync. 45 minutes is a lifetime. So we're closing those technology gaps. We have a product called Thunderdome, which is the primary zero trust product for DoD. Thunderdome is, again, leverages a ton of technologies. But if you allow those technologies to come into your machine all at the same time to do the protection that they need to do, your computer becomes a 1983 Mac Lisa. It just slows the heck down out of it. So we have built a technology that actually aggregates all of those needs so that you don't see degradation of performance while all of these backend systems are performing all the things they need to perform on your machine. This is the technology we're developing organically. We're looking for the gaps of things that haven't been created, and we're creating that technology ourselves because, again, reinventing the wheel does not help the warfighter, does not enable partnerships, does not do anything particularly useful.
And this relates to your 3 timeframe problem on defense tech. Could you lay that out for us?
I think one of the challenges that I'm acutely aware of, and I think a lot of people are trying to come to terms with, is we're living in a world where even with a defense budget that may be approximating $1 trillion, you say, well, $1 trillion should be enough for everything. Well, it may have been at a point in time, but we live at a point in time where technology is moving so quickly that you have to simultaneously fully fund an industrial base that takes care of technologies and requirements like munitions that haven't changed all that much since the 70s and 80s. You have a set of technologies that you need to keep up with and modernize that are things that are in the field right now. And you need to be building the next generation technologies like, mass attritable drones and all of those things. And the challenge is, how do you fund all those 3 at the same time? Because as I think we are learning around the world in conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and as we face into peer adversaries, especially like China, you can't afford to say, well, I'm only going to focus on the next generation because you do need basic munitions, or I'm only going to focus on the traditional industrial base because they are developing next generation and we cannot afford to be behind, right? So at the same time, we need to sustain some technology systems, for example, that are 40 years old. We need to continue to accelerate things on the cloud, and we need to build quantum, for example. And you say, well, which is the priority? The answer is yes, they're all the priority. So that's the 3 timeframe problem that we need to solve for. And again, I go back to the only solution I see is speed. We need to accelerate against each one of those because, first of all, we need to lower the cost across all of them. But second, because as these newer technologies accelerate, we're going to be able to finally attrit some of the things that are on the long tail from 40 and 50 years ago.
And this, I think, relates a lot to how, and you mentioned this before, your internal venture fund works, run by our friend Brian, who I think we're going to have on the show in the next month or 2. You recently announced that you're tripling the size of the fund to $300 million. What inspired that, and how is Booz Allen's venture fund different from other corporate venture arms by other companies in the defense space?
The original thesis was there are a number of companies out there that we need to have a relationship with because what they do and what we do can be truly complementary. And again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we work with a number of companies. Hidden Level is a good example. They make a passive drone detection technology that is second to none. We're not going to go replicate that. They're really good at it. They're investing in it, and they're excellent. But that sits well with our CITEX platform, which is essentially what's behind the TAC, the Tactical Assault Kit. And we wanted that integrated. And there's a reality which is in this world, if you make an investment, an actual dollar investment, that's the truest form of partnership. And so we're not in it to generate a venture return, although the returns on the fund, if you have Brian, he'll be proud to tell you, are top decile or top quartile or whatever. It is the strategic value of these relationships, both for us and for the companies that we're investing in, is what we're after.
Sort of like powering your own solutions engine and the country's solutions engine.
Exactly right. And so it's an investment in us, an investment in the country, an investment in all these companies all at the same time. But what comes with it, and the thing that I think is the coolest part, is the strategic opportunities that we look for together with these companies. And they can bring us into things. We can bring them into things. We're agnostic about that. But together, we can really do some unique stuff. And this was so successful that we've decided to triple it. And I'm not sure that we're done. I think tripling it could become more than that. The other thing we're thinking about simultaneously is our venture fund works really well with early stage companies. There's a lot of mid-stage companies that we need to figure out how to build the same kinds of relationships with. We have a great relationship with Shield AI. We're doing some really cool stuff together that neither one of us could do on our own. And that's where the real power comes in.
For various reasons, Booz Allen doesn't advertise that much, but you have some incredible internal expertise on adversary countries and capabilities. I know you have some open source analysts. You also have some embedded analysts. How do you rely on internally this expertise to power the technology investments and solutions that you're building?
We do know a lot about what's happening in the world, in part because of our own investments in open source technologies, and in part because of the work that we do for our key customers in national security. I get, for example, a monthly report on what's happening in cyber around the world and what's happening in AI around the world, with a particular focus on some of the countries that won't surprise you we're almost interested in. And then what's happening in some of the key intersections. So what is China doing in AI in space, which is an area that Booz Allen is investing in? Because understanding those vectors for them as a country helps us understand not just where the puck is, but where the puck is going to be. What are we as a country going to have to do to continue to stay ahead of China if this is their investment vector? So I'm super lucky that I have access to that level of knowledge as we plot our moves. It allows us, again, to try and stay ahead and invest in things like physical AI. Now everybody's talking about agentic, but we were talking about agentic before. It used to be called agent-oriented architectures. Now it's agentic. We're not talking enough about adversarial AI, which is how do you attack and defend AI models, which is something we're investing in quite significantly because we view that from a cyber perspective as a whole new attack surface that our country needs to be very worried about because, again, some of these actors around the world, whether they're bad actors or nation states, they are thinking about it and they're making moves.
If you could talk to engineers of any stripe or data scientists, so on and so forth, what would be your pitch to them for working at Booz Allen instead of another major technology company?
What I think distinguishes us is when you come to Booz Allen to bring your tech expertise, you're going to deploy it against missions that change lives. You're going to be working on things like Shrike, where we are helping accelerate the call to fire using AI. We did some testing in the early prototypes that has been decreased from 15 minutes to 1 minute. You're going to be working on bringing, for example, agentic into veterans claims processing, which is something that we're doing today, which allows our veterans to get their benefits that they so deserve a heck of a lot faster. You're going to be working on space missions in the national security area, where AI is fundamentally going to transform the way we actually understand what's happening around the world. The access to bringing your skill set into those missions is so unique. And part of our promise is there's this misconception, I know you hear it too, that the government moves so slowly that you're always 8 generations behind what's happening in the private sector, which is what deters a lot of people from coming into these fields. That is true in some cases. Okay, there's still some COBOL programming going on. But for the very vast majority of the work that we do, what is so cool is that you would be deploying the very same, and in some cases even further out, technology and expertise into these missions that matter so much. We're doing quantum at the level that any quantum company is doing, except we're doing it on the missions that matter.
You made a decision, of course, to partner with us here at War on the Rocks on Cogs of War, the vertical and podcast on defense tech, defense industry. What made you decide to do that?
One of the arguments about speed that I always make, and one of the arguments about where we are in our national security, is that our country needs to accelerate. and that we're not going to accelerate by having some of us worried about this or interested in this and a whole bunch of people thinking it doesn't matter or they can't contribute or it's too boring or it's not interesting or I just don't even know how to begin to have a conversation. And so what I see the value in what we're doing together is we need more people to understand and we need more companies to get on board that our national security is all of our responsibilities, all of our concerns, and all of us can make a contribution. We need an all-of-nation approach to this moment in time, not unlike the all-of-nation approach that we as a country were forced to see after World War II or after 9/11. Thank God we are not in that type of conflict right now. But if you look, and I know you agree, geopolitically at the world right now, this is the most complex geopolitical environment we've faced in maybe 50 years. And it's not going to get any easier anytime soon. And so we need everybody in. And I think that the mission that you guys serve in terms of getting people to fully understand it and find their vector into making their contribution is so essential that we love working with you on it.
There's a lot of reasons I've been excited to work with Booz Allen on this. And one of them is just the diversity of expertise internal to your company, which I think a lot of people don't understand. What's your pitch to people at Booz Allen to contribute to Cogs of War, be a part of the conversation? Of course, it's not just for people at Booz Allen. We mostly publish people at other companies, and anyone's welcome to publish in Cogs of War. But what's your pitch to your own teammates especially?
We want everybody at Booz Allen to both be proud of who we are as a nation, be proud of who we are at Booz Allen, and to be loud about it in both cases. And making a contribution, intellectual contribution to a platform like yours is a big part of being, again, loud and proud about all of this in a way that is not just shouting from the rooftops, hey, I love this country, I love Booz Allen, I love what we're doing, but it's also a meaningful contribution towards making all of that even better. If you can bring in an idea that is going to stimulate other people's idea engines, we're all in on that, and I want our workforce to be super proud of being able to contribute that way.
What's a book that early in your life especially meant a lot to you and shaped who you became?
I'm a huge science fiction geek. On the sci-fi front, when I was young, especially, Asimov had a big place in my head, expanding my head. If you've never read Asimov in Spanish, it's a trip. But he had a lot of impact on me as a teenager. As I got older, I actually have at home a first edition of Atlas Shrugged. There's a whole lot there, especially as I came to this country, that connected. And then when I was in college, and I know at this point the book doesn't have the reputation that it did back then, but there's a book called In Search of Excellence. In the early 80s, this was the management book that featured all of these companies that had become great and why they became great. And again, for a kid growing up in Argentina, there was so much to learn there. With the benefit of hindsight, a lot of those companies have gone out of business and this and that, which is why these kinds of books, don't have the shelf life. But for me at the time, even the basic idea that corporations should be in search of excellence was a novel concept, again, growing up in a country where we had at one point 200% monthly inflation, where stores would close in the middle of the day to raise prices. This notion that you could look beyond the immediate and think about the future and build a company for the future, that was a huge part of who I became.
If only truly great books could teach us how to think, we would never move forward. It's sometimes books that are just average or even bad can teach us how to think in unexpected ways.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And again, I mean,
and I'm not saying that is a bad book, but that's...
No. I'm not sure if it's a good book either, but I think, again, at that point in time where this notion of, and then there are books after that, Built to Last and Good to Great. I mean, they all are sort of different articulations of the same theme. And it's what I've tried to do with Booz Allen, which is how do you lead a company to become better than it is? And how do you lead a company that can last and outlast you? And that was the big thing for me is, I want to be outlasted by Booz Allen by 100 years or more. And the day that is time for me to ride into the proverbial sunset, I want that to be a big part of my legacy. I want that to be the totality of my legacy. That and the people that I've had a chance to mentor and work with.
It strikes me as we've been speaking that I've never read an Argentinian novel. What would you recommend I start with?
Depends on what you like. Borges is probably the most interesting, most fascinating Argentinian writer that ever lived. And all of his stuff is truly great. I may get kicked out I'm a U.S. citizen. I don't have an Argentinian passport, so they can't revoke it. But the book I love the most in Spanish is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yes.
Of course, it's not Argentinian, so this in Argentina may be a little controversial.
I love that book.
But honestly, I think there's a lot of really fascinating Latin American fiction.
I read that book when I was in my early 20s, and I was very sick with like 104-degree fever in a youth hostel in Prague. And being that sick kind of actually enhanced the experience of reading the book.
I'm sure that's right, yeah. Because it's,
So
there's
kooky.
a lot of things that you're not really sure if they're real or hallucinations. So if you're hallucinating yourself, I can imagine how that makes the book better.
What's a book that you've read very recently that has sort of stuck with you a bit?
I'm an avid reader, but when I had children, I decided to finally break down and go into audiobooks because I could, push a stroller and listen to a book, walk the dog and listen to a book, work out and listen to a book. So on the not very deep. And I've been just I'm looking at my Audible library. What have I been reading recently? I just finished rereading the entire Old Man's War, a series by John Scalzi, because after a 20-year hiatus, his new book is coming out in a month or so. And I've now gotten to a point where I used to never reread a book because I didn't need to. My memory was that good. Now I need to reread books before I read the next one. There's nothing that deep around that. The other thing I am reading on the sort of nonfiction side is I'm trying to learn quantum on my own. I'm old enough now that when I went to school, they taught a little bit of quantum mechanics, but not a whole lot. And I am trying to understand why quantum entanglement works and how it works.
Maybe foreshadowing some future Booz Allen moves.
Well, we're not foreshadowing. I mean, we're doing it. I really do believe quantum is one of these areas where we as a country have to be first. Quantum is more than just quantum computing. It's quantum sensing and it's quantum encryption and all of that. Booz Allen is already making moves on that, both through our venture portfolio, but through the work that we're doing. And again, I'm a lifelong learner. So if we're going to be doing quantum, I'm a first principles guy. I need to actually try and understand with my limited ability to do physics, the basic principles and a little bit of the math.
You once said there's a difference between winning and succeeding. What did you mean by that?
I look at success as something that is more permanent. So it's a combination of winning for the long term and how you win. It's not that short-term wins aren't good, but if you're into sports, right? I mean, the teams that we all remember are not the teams that went to the Super Bowl one year or won it one year. They're the teams that went to the playoffs and were Super Bowl contender for 5, 10, 15 years. And those teams are more than winning teams. They're successful teams. They built something that is unique, that transcended at some point an individual player, an individual coach, an individual quarterback. And so as I think about Booz Allen, as I think about my career, as I think about what I'm trying to teach my children, again, there's a difference between I won a game and I won a tournament and I won 10 tournaments. And to win 10 tournaments, you have to have built a system of success that, again, endures, that is hard to replicate, that is hard to match. And that's the difference.
Thanks so much for listening to this cross-posted episode of Cogs of War. You can follow along with all the exciting stuff we're doing at Cogs by signing up for our free bi-weekly newsletter at warntherocks.com/cogs-of-war. Stay safe and stay healthy.